Chapter 14. Garrulous Premier. My lord, wise men ne'er wail their present woes, but presently prevent the ways to wail. Shakespeare, King Richard II, 3.2, verses 173 to 174. Ali Amini had something of Polonius in him, beginning with his first acceptance speech as the Prime Minister. Through his many subsequent radio chats and public lectures, he came to be known for his long, sometimes meandering speeches. His garrulous nature came to be a favorite subject for satirists, who made fun of his volubility and of his attempt to use words and verbiage as a balm and a substitute for jobs and real change. For the Shah, a phrase in one of Amini's talks, where he declared the Iranian economy bankrupt, was a convincing sign of either his unsavory intentions or his dangerously irresponsible discourse. It mattered little to the Shah that the Iranian economy had indeed been practically bankrupt for years, and had survived only thanks to the infusion of millions of dollars of aid from the United States, or that, at the time Amini made the announcement, the Iranian government did not have money to put its most rudimentary expenses. The Shah did have a point, however, in arguing that even if the economic realities were dire, the Amini announcement made them worse and frightened away millions of dollars of potential investments. In reality, the Shah's dislike of Amini was rooted as much in blood as in politics. Amini had Qajar blood in him. He was a grandson of the Qajar king. His mother, Fakhr al-Dawleh, was considered by Reza Shah to be one of the most powerful and assertive members of the Qajar dynasty. She is the only man the Qajar family has produced, Reza Shah reportedly said. In politics and in business, she was assertive, ambitious, and willing to go where few other women of her generation and class dared to tread. In business, for example, she launched the first modern taxi service in the country, something aristocratic women deemed beneath their dignity. In politics, she was widely connected to different centers of power, and unabashedly used her network of friends and family to promote her favorite son's career. She considered the premier's office something of a family heirloom, and wanted her ally, Ali, to return the family to its days of glory. If a dangerous and despised bloodline was not enough to poison the Shah's relations with Amini, there was also the question of politics. The Shah never trusted Ali Amini, considering him dangerously ambitious, incorrigibly opportunistic, and shamelessly America's boy. From 1950 to 1955, when the Shah was in the fight of his life with the three most powerful politicians in his tenure, Kazem Mossadegh and General Zahedi, Amini was a member of all three men's cabinets. He was a protege of Kazem and a blood relative of Mossadegh. General Zahedi, too, was a distant relative, but with him, Amini had more a marriage of convenience than of shared political passions. It was a measure of Amini's character, his opportunism, or a knack for survival, that he eventually turned against all three prime ministers. The pinnacle of power was that Amini coveted, and neither he nor his mother would be satisfied with anything less. No sooner had General Zahedi established his headquarters at the Officers' Club on the afternoon of August 19th, 1953, than Fakhr el-Dawla called asking the general not to forget my Ali. There was, at that time, still no ministerial profiler. There was, at that time, still no ministerial portfolio designated for Amini, but luck intervened. The first two candidates for the post of finance minister could not be located in the chaos of that bloody day. By late on August 18th, many of the royalists had gone into hiding, fearing the end of the monarchy. Some were late in returning to their homes, desperate to form a full cabinet before the end of the day. General Zahedi, according to his son, Ardashir Zahedi, named Amini to the vacant post of finance minister. A few months later, while Amini was still the finance minister, the Shah asked him whether he did not look forward to being a prime minister. Amini's cautiously affirmative response only begot a more ominous question from the Shah. Was he not looking forward to something more than prime minister? The Shah asked. The implication of the question was hard to miss. Just like his father, the Shah believed that the political ambitious members of the Qajar family had designs on the Pahlavi throne, and Amini was nothing if not ambitious. Even in exile, after having witnessed Amini's willingness to help save the Pahlavi throne in 1979, the Shah still disparaged him as America's own man. At the same time, in the early days of the Kennedy administration, Amini was, for the Shah, the lesser of two evils. The Shah was under pressure from the United States to reconcile with the National Front and bring them into coalition government. Even after the Amini appointment, U.S. pressure for such a reconciliation continued. The majority of the National Front leadership ultimately decided against making peace with the Shah. The memory of August 19th, 1953, and the fall of Dr. Mossadegh were fresh in their minds. Mossadegh was still under virtual house arrest and barred from taking part in politics. Though they were ostensibly representative of Iran's moderate middle class, the leaders of the National Front preferred Puritan but quixotic militancy over pragmatic realism. In the famous words of Khalil Maliki, himself a supporter of Mossadegh, a one-time leader of the National Front, and the lone voice advocating the wisdom of a pragmatic reconciliation with the Shah, particularly against what he considered the patently more reactionary clergy. These National Front leaders are not even demagogues, but merely followers of the demos. But the Shah, too, was adamantly against the idea of reconciliation. He used thinly disguised language to attack the National Front leaders for making peace with separatists in Azerbaijan in 1946. He chastised them for using the cover of night to meet with representatives of foreign governments and to benefit financially from these contacts, and then poison the atmosphere. A National Front government, he told the American ambassador in a private luncheon at Asadollah Elami's home, would be a precursor of communist takeover. The leaders of the National Front, the Shah went on to say, have no purpose except to come to power. Moreover, their organization has been badly infiltrated by communists. Aside from the age-old argument that the National Front would pave the way for communism, the argument used by the British in 1952 when they were trying to convince the Truman administration to join in the effort to topple Mossadegh. The Shah in 1961 also offered a different argument against the idea of such a coalition. On numerous occasions, he told American and British officers that in Iran, the Shah has always been the center of power. Without a powerful king, the center could not hold. This time, cognizant of the Kennedy administration's keen interest in introducing reforms in Iran, the Shah told the American ambassador that if there were to be any meaningful reform in Iran, it had to come under the aegis of the Shah and no one else. He also made it clear on numerous occasions that he would abdicate rather than accept the position of a figurehead. That was the appointing Amini was compared to sharing power with the National Front. For the Shah, the lesser of the two evils, but an evil nevertheless. That might also explain why the Amini appointment in May 1961 was a surprise to nearly everyone, including Amini himself. Though he had coveted this post all his adult life, when he was summoned to the court and asked by the Shah to form a government, he was, according to the U.S. Embassy, surprisingly unprepared for the job, both in regard to having a program and a nucleus of capable individuals to help him discharge the heavy task he assumed. Before accepting the job, Amini insisted on having more power and independence than had previous prime ministers, but he still did not have complete freedom to form his cabinet. The Shah insisted on keeping his right to name the ministers to the three key ministries of War, Foreign Affairs, and Interior. The rest of the cabinet, hastily put together, was a coalition of lapsed communist, socialist, and independent critics and opponents of the Shah. There was also one leader of the National Front, Ghulam Ali Farivar, who had joined the cabinet as an individual and not as a member of the organization. Even so, he resigned before long under pressure from his comrades. Another controversial appointment was Nouraldin Alamati, named by Amini to the key Ministry of Justice. Alamati had been a member of the famous Group of 53, communist intellectuals led by Taghi Irani, who had been arrested during the reign of Reza Shah. It was believed that Alamati would vigorously go after those accused of graft and would not even spare members of the royal family. But the most controversial member of the Amani cabinet was easily Hassan Rafsanjani, the Minister of Agriculture. Like Amini, Rafsanjani was an old hand in Iranian politics, but unlike Amini, he had been unrestrained in his criticism of the Shah. He was a charismatic orator, a muckrating journalist, a self-styled socialist by avocation, and a lawyer by vocation. What made his career particularly fit the appointment was that he advocated the necessity of land reform in Iran. Like Amini, he had once been a protege of Qavam and a friend and accomplice of General Ghorani, the mastermind of the failed 1958 coup. In the very days when he was negotiating with the Shah's regime over his plans to establish a social democratic party, Rafsanjani was secretly conspiring with Ghorani to organize a coup. The Rafsanjani appointment became even more important when it emerged that implementing a land reform would be the centerpiece of Amani's plans for the controlled revolution he had come to lead. There is something of a consensuous There is something of a consensus amongst scholars and politicians that Rafsanjani's radicalism and charisma, his ambitions and his political acumen, made the Amini plan for land reform far more radical than initially intended. When the American embassy expressed concern about Rafsanjani's increasing radicalism, Amini reassured them by suggesting that such rhetoric was initially needed for taking the wind out of the sails of the National Front. At an appropriate time, Amini assured the American ambassador he would accept Rafsanjani's offer to resign. The Shah, too, began to worry about Rafsanjani as he watched him give more and more rousing speeches against feudalism and landowners. Larger and larger audiences of peasants were bussed into the cities and used as props for demonstrations that had more and more the discomforting aura of despotic populism. In a meeting with Israel's ambassador to Iran, Meir Ezri, the Shah asked the ambassador what he thought of Rafsanjani. The Shah must have known that Rafsanjani had developed close ties with Israel, whose advisors were at the time helping Iran develop large industrial agribusinesses. The Shah was himself an avid fan and advocate of these large-scale industrial farms. In response to the Shah's loaded question, Ezra gave an equally loaded response. Rafsanjani was not a minister of agriculture, but minister of peasants. As Ezra himself observed, this was a warning to the Shah, who began following Rafsanjani's populism more closely. Amini's reforms also included education, government services, election laws, and fighting corruption amongst government officials. Lest he be seen as a mere observer of the ongoing controlled revolution on November 14, 1961, the Shah issued a firman decreeing that Amini government was to continue full force with its reforms, particularly in education, improving the living standards of the poor, eliminating corruption, land reform, and eradicating corruption in the government. Though the royal decree was more a symbolic gesture than a serious policy statement, Amini played along, and the next day convened an emergency meeting of his ministers at which he informed them of the Shah's decree and asked them to redouble their efforts in implementing his Royal Majesty's command. About this time, Amini also sent a trusted advisor and a member of his inner circle, Khodadad Farman Farmayan, on a secret mission to Germany. Ostensibly, the purpose of the trip was to negotiate a German loan. In fact, Farman Farmian was also there to secretly meet with Robert Kennedy, the U.S. Attorney General. Farman Farmayan asked him, on behalf of Amini himself, that the United States show more public support for the Shah. An insecure Shah, Amini knew, was a ticking bomb. On the afternoon of November 15, 1961, the day Amini convened an emergency meeting of his cabinet to discuss the royal decree in another corner of the city, the Shah was on hand to open the country's first bowling alley. Azar Ebtihaj, the assertive, ambitious, and beautiful wife of Abul Hassan Ebtihaj, the one-time head of the Plan Organization, was one of the two partners who had introduced bowling to the country. The club, known simply as the Bowling, became an overnight sensation in the capital. Its restaurant was the city's hotspot where the jet-setters gathered. Since Soraya's days, the Shah became an avid bowler, and had a private lane constructed at the palace where he played regularly. After the launch of the bowling, the Shah sometimes played there. Though the royal presence added a certain cachet to the bowling, it was a financial drain since on the Shah's nights, for security reasons, the establishment would be ordered to keep all other customers out. But there was another connection between the bowling alley and the cabinet meeting discussing the Shah's order. Aside from the land reform, the most controversial new policy of the Amini government was the fight against corruption. A number of high-ranking officials of the regime were arrested and charged with embezzlement and misuse of public funds. Easily the most controversial act of the Amini government's anti-corruption campaign was the arrest of Abul Hassan Ebtihaj. The arrest was particularly startling because Ebtihaj was known for his financial probity and considered Amini a close friend. Since his appointment as the director of the Plan Organization in 1955, Ebtihaj had survived in power simply because of the Shah's support. His stern style of management, his no-nonsense attitude, his willingness to take on entrenched interest, his relentless attempt to streamline the country's economic planning decisions on his own, his distrust of Iranian contractors, and his belief that in those years only Western companies could be entrusted with big contracts and big projects, had all worked to make him many enemies among the elite. For years, the increasingly swollen ranks of his foes had constantly conspired against him. Their efforts failed in no small measure because of the Shah's support of Ebtihaj. Manukair Egbel and General Fazollah Zahidi, two of the prime ministers during Ebtihaj's tenure at the Plan Organization, were his unabashed enemies, but neither could dislodge him from the perch of power. The fact that Western banks and lending institutions trusted and supported Ebtihaj further contributed to his ability to survive his enemies' machinations. The Shah tended to divide key Iranian politicians between those connected to the United States and those with ties to Britain. However, he was confused about Ebtihaj. More than once, he asked the British and American ambassadors whether they thought Ebtihaj was connected to either power. In September 1955, for example, he told the British ambassador that the Americans thought Ebtihaj was pro-British. The ambassador answered that in his embassy some thought Ebtihaj was pro-American. The truth seems to be that both embassies thought Ebtihaj an unusually competent and reliable financier and an honest public servant, but a bit of an eccentric genius. But by 1959, Ebtihaj's luck was running out. On January 24, 1959, on a cold day when the Shah was bedridden with the flu, after numerous ignored requests, Ebtihaj was finally given an audience. One of the Shah's well-known ways to punish or show dismay with an official was to refuse to see him. Even if he ran into someone in an official ceremony, he would avoid exchanging even a glance with him. In his daily journals, Alam described many such episodes. Ebtihaj, who had for years been able to get a meeting with the Shah almost at will, was now getting the cold shoulder. After a few rebuffed attempts, he finally entreated to quit going to work unless the Shah agreed to meet with him. January 24th was set for the meeting. A few days later, Ebtihaj had submitted his resignation to the Shah, but had heard nothing back. But now, as Ebtihaj talked, the weak and sniff the weak and sniffling Shah simply listened without uttering a word. Ebtihaj talked of his increasing tensions with many of the country's political leaders. He also tried to make the case that the Iranian economy could not sustain the level of military expenditures the Shah consistently pressed for. The Shah said nothing. Silence was another of his known discursive tools for displaying displeasure and dismay. Though the Shah was angry with Ebtihaj, the accept and accepted though the Shah was angry with Ebtihaj and accepted his resignation, he still rejected the calls for his arrest. Knowing full well that the danger of arrest hung over his head, Ebtihaj put on the pretense of enjoying his unexpected retirement. He started work on launching a private bank, and before long he and his wife had established the Iranian Bank, with much of the capital provided by Western banks. Azar was chosen to sit on the board of the bank, becoming the first woman to attain such a high status in the world of Iranian finance. At the same time, Ebtihaj spent some of his time playing golf, a favorite pastime. One of his eccentricities was that, even before golf became the game of the rich and powerful in Tehran, he would occasionally appear at meetings dressed in his golf attire. He had played a role in helping a man named Kabar Khan build Tehran's first golf course. Kabar Khan was a flamboyant Iranian-born businessman who had returned to Iran in 1958 and set up a flashy office, hired a bevy of beautiful young women who were as much escorts as secretaries and receptionists, gave lavish parties and expensive gifts, and drove around in a Cadillac. Before long, through his friendship with Ebtihaj, Kabar Khan had established close ties among the Iranian elite, including some members of the royal family. But by the time Ebtihaj's resignation, Kabar Khan had returned to the United States, and by 1962 he was talking to the American media and testifying before Congress about what he alleged was massive corruption and misuse of American foreign aid by the Shah and a few other members of the royal family. For the next 5 years, Kabar Khan became nothing less than a nightmare for the Shah. The saga continued until well into 1965, at which time a federal court did in fact order all of the Shah's U.S. accounts frozen. The banks where the accounts were held immediately informed Mehdi Samai, a trusted confidant of the Shah, that unless they moved the assets before the banks opened the next day, the accounts of the Shah, and in fact of all the royal family, would be frozen. Samai contacted the Shah and received the requisite instructions to move the accounts, but before any action was necessary, another court overturned the lower court's order, and the danger passed. Within months of the episode, Kabar Khan was discovered to have forged the most incriminating documents against the Shah. Some of his allegations were similar to the charges made by Ebtihaj when he participated in a conference held at Stanford University in the fall of 1960. Ebtihaj talked about the failure of U.S. policy in Iran and how, in spite of having given $1 billion to the country over a few years, the United States was neither loved nor respected. The reason, he suggested, was that where the recipient government is corrupt, the donor government very understandably appears in the judgment of the public to support corruption. When the Shah heard about the lecture, he was livid. Friends and family advised Ebtihaj not to return, telling him that the Shah would have him arrested at the airport. A few months before his departure for the United States, the Shah had been angered by Ebtihaj's heated argument with American generals against the idea of expanding the Iranian army. The Shah also took umbrage at Ebtihaj's opposition to the construction of a chemical fertilizer near the city of Shiraz, a pet project of the Shah. Ebtihaj was opposed to the project not just because he felt it was economically unsound, but because he suspected that Iranian officials had made illicit gains from the deal. Each of these transgressions had not been enough individually to turn the Shah against Ebtihaj, but now their collective weight was more than he could tolerate. When he least expected it, during the tenure of his friend Amini, Ebtihaj was arrested and charged with financial malfeasance and with signing sweetheart no-bid contracts with the Development Resources Corporation of David Lilienthal, the architect of the famed Tennessee Valley Authority. Lest Ebtihaj find a way to leave prison, the largest bail in Iranian history to that time was set for him. But even in prison, Ebtihaj never shied away from expressing his often unique, sometimes contrarian views. Though he was an autodidact with little formal education, he was a brilliant banker and economist. His views on the land reform that was undertaken by the Amini government and that would eventually become the centerpiece of the White Revolution were an example of both his brilliance and his readiness to challenge received or popular opinion. When Ebtihaj learned about the Shah's upcoming trip to the United States, he decided to write a pithy, personal, and confidential letter from prison to his friends in America, hoping to convince them to stop the Iranian government's plans for land reform, contrary to the landowners and the clergy who were against the land reform as interested advocates of the status quo ante. Ebtihaj opposed the current plan because he thought it undermined the future long-term capitalist development of Iran. In his letter, Ebtihaj offered 10 reasons why the land reform was proposed was detrimental to Iran's national interest and capitalist development. Under a capitalist system of free enterprise, he wrote in his letter from prison, "It is not right and just that a person may own any number of factories, but be denied the right to own more than a certain amount of farmland." He agreed that the absence of landlordism was a curse and a problem for Iranian agriculture and the economy, but he suggested searching for ways to overcome the drawbacks without resorting to sequestration. Instead of confiscating property, he offered a land reform brought about through a system of taxation where farms would be taxed based on not actual but optimum yields. He proposed a simple but sophisticated system of taxation that would ultimately bring about the desired changes in the country's agricultural system without undermining the idea of private property. Ebtihaj's critique is particularly important in its is particularly important in its contrast with the Shah's willingness, indeed eagerness, to use the discourse of revolution and the practice of forced sequestration to promote his own political ends. Before long, the Shah would begin to talk incessantly of the White Revolution, and all manner of sequestration became part and parcel of the different principles of his revolution. The Shah had a pseudo-socialist status vision of the economy where the state could and should become an economic leviathan. As Ebtihaj had predicted, not long after the land reform, the Shah proved willing to forcefully expropriate the country's own private television network, the first private university, and the country's richest private mine. How much did the Shah's constant conjuring of revolutionary rhetoric help make the idea and concept of revolution part and parcel of the Iranian political discourse? In other societies, the word revolution often brings to mind cataclysmic changes. By 1978, the word had been a constant part of Iran's political vocabulary for almost 2 decades, and the idea of expropriating successful businessmen had also become normal. In 1962, neither the Shah nor Amini were willing to heed Ebtihaj's advice. Amini tried to use the promise of land reform to convince the leaders of the National Front to temper their criticism of his government and avoid confrontations with the police and security forces. A temporary political ceasefire would afford him the chance to consolidate the shaky foundations of his power. But a new generation of activists had joined the ranks of the front, and inspired by the revolutionary experiences in Cuba and Algeria, they kept pushing for more confrontational and radical policies. Incremental change of the kind promised by Amini was for them nothing but repressive tolerance, change intended to maintain the status quo. And when the leaders of the National Front announced plans to hold a mass rally in the Jalai racetrack, Amini used his many connections to these leaders to ask them to forego their planned rally. He asked for the respite of stability, a few months of peace during which he could establish his authority and fend off increasing attacks from members of the military. But the National Front would not relent. While younger leaders of the group increased their agitation at the university, leading to numerous confrontations between the government and the opposition, the elder leaders continued with plans for the Jalai mass rally. Some of these fucking names. I'm sorry. The Jalaliye event was at once a tour de force and a coup de grace for the National Front. The large field that had previously been used as a racetrack was filled with supporters. There was a prolonged, some say 15-minute exuberant show to support when the name of Dr. Mossadegh was first mentioned. For the Shah, the spectacle was nothing short of a nightmare, reminding him of his own darkest hours. Even more dangerous for the Shah was the idea that the large number of people at the rally would only convince the Kennedy administration to redouble their effort to bring the National Front into the government. But then the Shah received an unexpected bonanza from the mass rally. When it was Shapur Bakhtiar's turn to speak, he parted from the prepared text and had been approved by the collective leadership. Instead, he talked at great length and with frenzied fervor about the virtues of Iran's joining the ranks of non-aligned nations. But then, the non-alignment movement, launched by Indonesia's Sukarno in 1955, had become a formidable force around the world. The fact that Communist China had joined the movement made it even more suspect to American policymakers. In the Cold War vision, non-aligned nations were simply on a slippery slope, a short step from falling into the hands of the communists. Even the State Department, till then a reliable supporter of the National Front, was not amused by the group's sudden advocacy of non-alignment. From then on, to the Shah's relief, support for the idea of offering the National Front a share of power in Iran began to wane amongst American foreign policy experts. Moreover, the Shah made sure the embassy knew where he stood on the issue of non-alignment. In 1955, he had been one of the chief advocates of Iran's forfeiting in century-old declared neutrality and joining what he then called the Baghdad Pact, later renamed CENTO, C-E-N-T-O. In a meeting with the American ambassador in 1961, the Shah emphasized that he was still adamantly opposed to views on a neutral Iran, and considered such ideas absolutely indefensible. He indicated that, in his view, Iran must stay tied to the West, and if and when those ties should be broken, he would cease being Shah. Though Amini was in many ways anathema to the Shah, he had at least the virtue that, like the Shah, he was a firm believer in the idea that Iran must not only stay in the Western orbit, but also become ever closer to the United States. Amini, too, had been a fervent advocate of Iran's joining the Baghdad Pact. As these events unfolded in Iran, the United States was seriously studying its options with the Shah. On May 24, 1961, in a meeting of the National Security Council, President Kennedy, based on the recommendation of the Talbot Task Force, approved a new U.S. policy for Iran. For the immediate future, the new policy advocated that the United States make a major effort to back Amini as the best instrument in sight of promoting orderly political and economic and social revolution in Iran, and ensure that there were no military coups against him. Moreover, to give Amini more room to maneuver, it was decided the U.S. should be prepared to tolerate certain seemingly anti-American actions by Amini which do not really damage any major American interest. Not only did continued American support for Amini not bode well for the Shah, but the long-term elements of the new American strategy did not favor him either. It was decided that while the United States supported monarchy as the symbol of unity and a stabilizing influence in Iran, it should more actively encourage the Shah to move toward a more constitutional role. It was a measure of the Shah's resilience as a politician that, in spite of the great chasm that separated his own vision from the new policy prescribed by the Americans, the Shah not only stayed a close ally of the United States for the next 17 years, but also gradually forced a reconsideration of that policy. The irony is that ultimately his success in defying the American push for democracy and finding his own independent path proved to be his undoing. Had the Shah remained a constitutional monarch, as the American policy proposed in 1961, instead of becoming a modernizing, albeit authoritarian monarch, as the Shah wished, he might have been able to save his throne and the monarchy. But in 1961, the Shah also had to contend with the fact that the new American policy suggested that the U.S. should encourage the formation and growth of broadly based political parties in Iran. Up until that time, the Shah had willed into existence a semi-official two-party system modeled on that of the United States. In the Iranian incarnation of this system, the Shah directly controlled the affairs of both parties by appointing reliable politicians to head the two listless organizations. In due course, the Shah found a solution for the problem as well. Finally, lest the Shah be tempted to again blackmail the United States by using the Soviet Union as a bargaining chip, the new American strategy called for the United States to impress upon Iranian officials the risk which may be involved in Iran rapprochement with the USSR. Not only the opposition, but also elements within the regime itself sensed the changing political climate, while traditional opposition parties suddenly became more active and aggressive. New groups also began to emerge. The most successful such new group was launched by Dr. Mustafa Mesbahzadeh, publisher of Tehran's most popular daily Kayan. He called the group the Rashtakhiz, or the Resurgence. Mesbahzadeh was a man of tact and had many connections amongst Iran's political cognoscenti and the intelligentsia. He was also close to such powerful political figures as Alam and even to the Shah himself, particularly given the fact that in 1941 the Shah had provided some of the initial capital for launching Kayan itself. Most important of all, as he had shown throughout his adult life, Mesbahzadeh had an unfailingly sharp nose for detecting changing political winds. His Rastakaz movement prompted people to converge on rented rooms, offices, and storefronts to talk about the situation in the country, discussions that often had a subtext critical of the regime. The organization rapidly spread throughout the country, and there was a clear sense of spontaneity about the movement's burst of energy and expansion. What afforded the meetings an even more unusual political air was the absence of the Shah's portrait in the halls where the group met. By then, having a portrait of the Shah in each office and store was virtually mandatory. Every movie began by showing a portrait of the Shah while the royal anthem was played, and audiences were expected to stand at attention while the portrait was on the big screen. If the absence of royal portraits was, in the minds of the people, a sign of the movement's authentic spontaneity, it was also the cause of Rashtakid's demise. As soon as the Shah was told about the meetings in halls with no royal portrait, he found a way of showing his displeasure to Mesbahzadeh, who was nothing if not cautious. Before long, he pulled the plug on his movement. The Shah's relationship with Amini was far more complicated. He had to make sure that Amini did not amass too much power, but he also had to at last appear to still be supporting the cabinet. The Shah had still not met with Kennedy, but was fully aware of his firm support for Amini. For his part, Amini also knew that so long as he enjoyed the support of the United States, he would be safe in his seat of power. Early in June 1961, he dispatched his trusted advisor, Khodadad, Khodadad, Farman Farmayan, Farman, Christ, on an exploratory journey Tehran was in those days awash with rumors that the Shah intended to replace Amini by Timur Bakhtiar. Farmayan met with the State Department official and pointedly asked whether in fact the United States was cooling off in its support of Amini. The State Department categorically denied the allegation. The National Front refused to support Amini while using the freedoms he had provided to organize increasingly militant demonstrations against him and the regime. The Shah's support for Amini was at best tentative and temporary. In addition, the military and Savak, both staunchly royalists, and worried about what Amini might do to their budgets, were also no friend of his cabinet. These factors made the Americans virtually Amini's sole source of support. In early May 1961, the United States received intelligence about General Timur Bakhtiar was planning a coup against the Amini government. The general was brazen about the coup plans. He had even decided on the composition of his cabinet and began meeting with each of them separately in a garden near Tehran. To each he described his plans, offered them a portfolio, and sought their support. The list of his designated ministers was eventually published in Bakhtar Imruz, an opposition paper that belonged to the National Front. Many of those who remained powerful ministers in the next 15 years, including Jashid Amuzegar, were on the list. There were also rumors about General Bakhtiar's attempt to form an alliance, not only with the National Front, but with the Marxist Tudeh Party, as well as with the landowners opposed to the land reform, and finally with the clergy. On May 17th, the United States took all steps necessary to discourage General Bakhtiar against initiating any action against Amini. With no support from the United States, with the Shah waiting for the right moment to rid himself of the dangerously meddlesome general, and with Amini keen on getting rid of this overambitious foe, Bakhtiar's days were now clearly numbered. But Bakhtiar was not the only general conspiring against Amini. On May 15th, around the same time that Bakhtiar was planning his coup, General Haj Ali Kia, who had been jailed on charges of financial corruption, sent a trusted emissary to the U.S. government with a message that suggested they should either plan a coup, in which case General Kia promised the full support of his assets, or at least support a coup, which he planned to initiate on his own. The United States responded that the U.S. government completely supports the current government and has no desire to encourage activities directed against Amini, and would in fact strongly discourage such activities. It is not known whether the Shah knew about or was later informed about these attempted military coups. But at the same time, while the United States deterred ambitious generals from attempting a coup against Amini, they also decided that a public declaration of support for him would be the crystallization of the Shah's fear and suspicion of Amini as America's boy. Eventually, they decided to send Edward Mason to Tehran. He had been the head of the Harvard Advisory Group that had in 1958 helped develop a stabilization program for Iran. Mason's mandate was to appraise the situation and estimate Amini's chances of survival. The Shah, on the other hand, was still trying to arrange for a speedy meeting with President Kennedy. In addition to his two long personal notes, the first on January 26 and the second through General Bakhtiar on March 1, 1961, he pressured the American embassy in Tehran for an early invitation for a state visit to the United States. The Kennedy White House was less than enthusiastic about preferring such an invitation to the Shah. They did not want the Shah to erroneously assume that the United States was now content with the situation in Iran. In other words, they wanted to keep the Shah both anxious and guessing about America's intentions. Robert Kennedy was particularly opposed to the idea of inviting the Shah anytime soon. The Shah, he said, was not a beloved figure in his country, and there was little advantage in having him here. According to Kennedy, there was even a chance that the Shah may be ousted. The embassy in Tehran, sensing White House reluctance, tried to change the administration's mind by pointing to the Shah's dangerously fragile state of mind. The embassy reminded the White House that the Shah was now in one of his periodic moods of depression. Finally, the White House relented and offered to invite the Shah to visit Washington in November 1962. But the Shah simply could not wait that long. When he heard about the November date, he demurred, arguing that in light of the country's dire situation, the proposed date was too far in the future. The American embassy in Tehran once again supported the Shah's claim, suggesting that he was in no psychological state to wait that long. Ultimately, the White House gave in once more, and it was decided to invite the Shah for an official visit to the United States on April 10, 1962. Then, there was the question of how best to convey the invitation to the Shah. Some in the White House argued that since Robert Kennedy was planning a tour of Asia, he would make a stop in Tehran and personally deliver the invitation. The purpose of inviting the Shah, according to these officials, was to build the Shah up, and thus a visit from the Attorney General would certainly help boost the Shah's shaken confidence. But the State Department and Robert Kennedy himself were, for different reasons, against the idea. The Attorney General personally disliked, even despised the Shah, and insisted that should he be asked to visit him, he would insist on also meeting with some of the opposition student groups there. The Iranian embassy in Washington was by then already entangled in something of a conflict with the Justice Department over the fate of some of the Iranian students living in the United States who actively opposed the Shah. In the late 1950s, thousands of Iranian students had begun to converge on the European and American universities. Until then, educational sojourns in the West had been a privilege limited to the children of the elite, indispensable to the Shah's modernization plans was a large, trained, technocratic class. But Iran lacked the educational infrastructure to train such a class. A sociologist has called the late 50s the age of the technocrats. American policy in Iran also advocated that new young technocrats gradually take the place of traditional politicians. Starting in the late 1950s, cheap bus and train service from Iran to Europe became available, and before long, students from all social classes began to arrive in the West. Some of the more radical new students used their newfound freedom in Western democracies to create the Confederation of Iranian Students, an international organization that became a formidable foe of the Shah throughout the rest of his tenure. One of the first signs of the coming troubles took place in March 1960, during the party celebrating the Persian New Year. Till then, the Iranian embassies in Western capitals had hosted these parties. Even before becoming Iran's ambassador to the United States, while he still lived in Iran, Ardashir Zahidi had been put in charge of making sure Iranian students studying abroad received adequate help and assistance. When he was named Iran's ambassador to the United States, he showed particular interest in forging friendships and alliances with many of these students as he could. He went out of his way to make the 1960 New Year celebration a success. But as he and his wife Shahnaz, the Shah's daughter, arrived at the party, radical students began anti-Shah chants, and one of them threw a plate that hit Shahnaz. She was not hurt, but her already strong aversion to appearing in official ceremonies only increased, becoming a point of tension between her and her husband. One of the students who turned the Persian New Year party into a political demonstration was Sadek Kotzbazadeh. In 1979, he was prominently in the Shah's life during his pariah days of exile. In the early 1960s, Kotzbazadeh was peculiarly Qotbzadeh. You sound it out. Was a peculiar problem for the Kennedy administration. On February 20th, 1961, the White House received a memorandum that registered one of the officials' perplexing encounter with Qotbzadeh. Okay, I get it. QOT, you could say, is caught. ZADEH could be Zada. But you put a B in the middle of that? Kotzbazadeh? That's the best I can do with that. For advocates of conspiracy theories, particularly those who claim that the Islamic Revolution was the work of the United States, the contents of the memo would be nothing short of a smoking gun. The official had met at Georgetown University. Now, we have a footnote on that son of a bitch. I call him a son of a bitch because I can't pronounce his name, but we'll just say Kotzbazadeh. Now, here's the footnote. A flashy young Iranian student named Kotzbazadeh, who says he is a Mossadequist, but looks like a communist and acts like a communist, even smells like a communist. He is failing his courses, will not work at his studies, and has a new girl in tow every few days. This man sees people like Senator Humphreys, Sikh, Justice Douglas, and even the Attorney General regularly. He tells everybody about how the smart men in the highest levels of the American government are all against the Shah and sympathetic with Kotzbazadeh and his friends, and how it will be only a little while before there will be an American-sponsored revolution in Iran, and the Shah will be killed or exiled. He says he will be no, I'm sorry, this isn't really a footnote. Anyway, this is the report of the official that met at Georgetown University. Continuing, he says he will then be a cabinet minister. He said long before the announcement of the cancellation of the Attorney General's visit to Iran that the Attorney General had promised him personally that he would not go to Tehran. That's the end of that report. The Shah's regime attempted to have Kotzbazadeh extradited to Iran. Robert Kennedy was instrumental in making sure this never happened. Nearly 3 decades later, Kotzbazadeh was the key player in the saga of the new Islamic regime's attempt to force Panama to send the Shah back to Iran. Eventually, Kotzbazadeh flamboyant, grandiose, and ambitious ideas put him on a collision course with Ayatollah Khomeini, who ordered him once docile aide and de facto spokesperson executed. Before the Shah's hopes for a journey to the United States became reality as political tensions and economic difficulties continued to plague Iran, And as the political impasse between Amini and the Shah over the size of the military budget and the extent of the Shah's power continued, as Amini rebuffed the Shah's offer to change his cabinet, getting rid of some of the more controversial ministers but staying on as prime minister, the Shah toyed with the idea of firing Amini and acting as his own prime minister. The American embassy was quick to disabuse the Shah of the wisdom of the idea of doing that. The message from the United States was clear. The Shah should continue to support Amini and not assume direct responsibility. In the same note, the embassy was instructed to tell the Shah that any additional U.S. economic assistance would be predicated on the contribution on the would be predicated on the continuation of the Amini program, and that he should be kept on the job for at least 6 months. For the Shah, this must have been at once a blessing and a blight. He had to live with Amini for a few more months. But now there was at least light at the end of the tunnel. A conceivable date of getting rid of Amini, and as it happened, he kept Amini in his post until July 1962, exactly 6 months from the date of that American advice. The Shah did offer Amini an olive branch when he agreed to his wish to get rid of General Bakhtiar. Early in his tenure, Amini had insisted on arresting Bakhtiar for conspiring against the government. The Shah was happy to oblige, but only partially. After his dismissal as the head of SAVAK in 1961, Bakhtiar had set up offices, ostensibly for business, but actually as a de facto headquarters for forces working against Amini. Generals and landlords, dismayed at the government reforms, gathered there and openly conspired against Amini. But then, on January 21st, 1962, students demonstrated at Tehran University, and the army entered the campus without even consulting the chancellor of the university and left behind 1 dead and 200 injured students, including 3 American young men studying in Iran at the time. Amini saw Bakhtiar's hand behind the incident. Some sources have claimed that, in fact, no one, including Bakhtiar, could have used the military without the direct consent of the Shah. They point to the Shah's apparent use of the military in 1942 to rid himself of Kavum, another of the Shah's foes. Amini, too, seemed to harbor such ideas, but when he met with the Shah, he blamed it all on Bakhtiar and sought permission to arrest him. The Shah demurred, reminding Amini of Bakhtiar's role in fighting the communist Tudeh Party members, and suggesting that instead of arresting the general, he should be allowed to leave the country. The next day, the Shah called Bakhtiar to the court and ordered him to leave the country immediately. If the Shah assumed that in this way he would use one enemy to rid himself of another, he was badly mistaken. General Hassan Pakravan had been named by Bakhtiar's replacement as head of SAVAK in 1961, and the change was profound in terms of SAVAK's culture and image. Pakravan was known as the intellectual of the Iranian security organizations. He was a man of considerable erudition and refinement himself, and some of Iran's well-known intellectuals, including famed writer Sadiq Chubak, acclaimed poet Mohammad Zahari, and Mozaffar Baghai, were amongst his friends. Immediately after taking over, he ordered an end to all torture in SAVAK prisons. In 1958, when he was still deputy director of SAVAK, he concluded that not communists but radical nationalists who represent the frustrated nationalism and reformist aspirations of the urban middle classes had become the greatest danger to the future stability of Iran. Now that he was named the new head of SAVAK, he had a chance to make his ideas into policy. His views were a radical departure from the dominant paradigm of the Shah and of the intelligence agencies, who believed that communism was the main threat faced by the regime, and that in the fight against the infidel Marxists, the pious mullahs were the monarchy's natural allies, and nationalist Democrats a secondary foe. But Pakravan's turn at the helm was short-lived. As the Shah gingerly maneuvered the fine line of appearing to support Amini while maintaining as much of his own power as possible, other issues also complicated his agenda. On March 30th, 1961, the 89-year-old Grand Ayatollah Boroujerdi died in the city of Qom. In terms of its effect on the development of Shi'ism in Iran, his death had an enormous impact. A book published only weeks after the Ayatollah's death by a group that called itself the National Central Committee of Islamic Societies in Iran discusses in detail the perils and promises entailed in the death of the Grand Ayatollah for the Shiite world. Several of the authors of the compilation were virtual unknowns at that time, but they would become in less than 2 decades the leaders of the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The book offers fascinating clues to the sophisticated network of Islamic groups that operated in Iran, even during the period when the Shah's authoritarianism was at its height. The left was self-indulgent, believing that the inevitable laws of history would eliminate religion, the opium of the masses, and place them as the revolutionary vanguard on history's pedestal. The Shah and his secret police, on the other hand, were focused on fighting communists and the National Front, and believed the forces of faith to be the best antidote to the spread of the communist disease. In the meantime, the Islamists were creating a vast, nimble, multi-layered network of groups and institutions, everything from armed organizations to the most apparently benign classes in how to read the Qumran. The Qumran. The Quran. Almost concurrent with the mid-1961 publication of the book on Shi'ism and the death of the Ayatollah, 2 of the contributors to the book, Medhi Bazargan and Mohammad Telagani, both hitherto little-known members of the National Front, wrote a letter to Mossadegh asking his permission to split from the National Front. The note caught all but no attention at the time. It heralded the birth of the freedom movement. The group might have remained a small footnote to Iranian history, had it not, in 1979, been chosen by Ayatollah Khomeini, better yet, used by him as his democratic camouflage, to form the first provincial revolutionary government of Iran. In that capacity, the group also played a crucial role in the last months of the Shah's life. Ayatollah Boroujerdi's death also raised for the Shah the thorny question of sending a note of condolence. It was a custom that upon the death of an Ayatollah of Boroujerdi's stature, the Iranian king, as the only ruler of Shiite-dominant state, would send a note of condolence to the presumptive successor of the dead cleric. There were at the time several Ayatollahs who lived in the 2 Iranian cities of Qom and Mashhad, and in Iraqi city of Najaf. Each of the men could easily be considered the legitimate successor of Ayatollah Boroujerdi. Moreover, since the early 20th century, there had been a constant competition between the Iraqi city of Najaf and the Iranian city of Qom to become the center of Shiite learning and authority. The Shah worried about the emergence of a contending center of power in his domain, was keen on strengthening Najaf's claim to supremacy, and thus chose to send his telegram of condolence to Ayatollah Hakim in Najaf. Hakim had the added advantage of also being from the quietest school of Shi'ism, wherein the task of the clergy is not to seize political power and create the Islamic State, as Ayatollah Khomeini later advocated, but to focus on the spiritual health of the flock and on blocking laws and values inimical to Islam. Ayatollah Borujerdi's death even put the U.S. government in an awkward position. On the one hand, the White House knew that the Soviet Union and Great Britain were sure to have one of their most prominent leaders send the Shah a note to offer their condolences. On the other hand, the White House was also fully aware of Ayatollah Borujerdi's role in the persecution of the Baha'is minority in 1955. The White House worried that the Baha'is of the U.S. centered in the Chicago area might react unfavorably to the formal communication from the president. Eventually, it was decided that in his next meeting with the Shah, the U.S. ambassador to Iran should offer him the president's sympathy verbally. There's a footnote here on Ayatollah Hakim at the bottom of the page. Footnote: in a strange twist of fate, the son of the same Ayatollah would 30 years later become the chief ally of the Iranian regime in its attempt to gain influence in Iraq. End of footnote. Amini, ever sensitive to the clergy's power and hoping to garner their support for his government, not only sent notes of condolence to all the Ayatollahs, but decided before long to go to the city of Qom and visit with the top clerics there. There was considerable behind-the-scenes bickering about the list of Ayatollahs Amini should visit, and for reasons that have been never made clear, he chose to include Ayatollah Khomeini in that list. While certainly an influential teacher of the seminary and popular with the young generation of clerics, Khomeini was certainly not on par with other established Ayatollahs of the city. The decision dismayed over Ayatollahs, particularly the moderate Ayatollah, Shariat Madari, who later became Khomeini's chief clerical opponent and a secret ally of the Shah. Though by then Amini had developed a reputation for his love of long, meandering speeches in the meeting with Ayatollah Khomeini, it was the Ayatollah who did almost all the talking. In a tone that was surprisingly conciliatory, the Ayatollah talked of two kinds of prime ministers in the past: those who served the people and became popular, and those who worked against the people and begot only the people's hatred. He invited Amini to try and join the rank of the first group and offered an alliance with the clergy as the surest way for him to achieve that goal. Amongst the clergy's concerns, Ayatollah Khomeini said, was the fact that the universities around the country were spreading the seeds of faithlessness, and he wanted Amini to unite with the mullahs, 5,000 or 6,000 of them studying in Qom House Seminary alone, and rid the universities of the curse of secularism. Ayatollah Khomeini wanted the clergy consulted on the question of university curriculum. The demand seemed outlandish at the time. Less than 2 decades later, they became the official government policy of the new clerical regime in Iran. Even in 2010, after 30 years of clerical rule, and with one cultural revolution behind them already, Khamenei, the leader of the Islamic regime, still defiantly railed against what he called the rampant materialism, rationalism, and skepticism of Iranian universities, particularly those teaching social sciences. He ordered an Islamization of the curriculum, just as Khomeini had done in 1961. Amini ended his controversial meeting with Khomeini by admitting that the Iranian government in the last 20 years had indeed misled the people into moral and spiritual morass, and promised, with God's help, all of the problems will be solved. The implicit criticism of the Shah was hard to miss. Amini's remarks also captured the disharmony that defined the nature of power in Iran. Though the country was in a state of crisis, the Shah and the Prime Minister were both engaged in a dance of deception, both pretending unity in public, and each worked hard against the other in private. The first few years of the 60s were also times of triumph and turmoil in the Shah's private life. First, there was the birth of the much anticipated son and heir to the throne. On October 31st, 1960, the court issued a statement announcing the birth of a son to the royal couple. 6 months earlier, on the eve of the Persian New Year, in a similar announcement, the court had announced that the Queen was pregnant. In those days there was no ultrasound technology, and thus the gender of the fetus remained a mystery to the parents. Traditional families resorted to varieties of rituals and prayers, as well as exotic herbs and strange animal parts, to ensure that the child was a boy. The Queen was already feeling pressure from the royal family, and was even told that she should visit a doctor to increase her chances of bearing a son. An old seamstress, who had worked for the Queen's family in earlier years, told her that writing a prayer on her belly with mud that had been blessed by a saint would guarantee a son, while another believed that a diet of mandarins and oranges would also get her a son. The future of her marriage, she knew, depended on the gender of her fetus. In her memoir, she writes of bursting into tears and she had given birth to a boy. When she had heard that she had given birth to a boy. I thought to myself, she writes in refreshing honesty, if I had had a daughter, what would have happened? Before the day of delivery, an attending gynecologist Before the day of delivery, the attending gynecologist predicted that the child would be a boy. The Shah, on the other hand, told the press conference that while for a father it makes no difference whether his child is a boy or girl, but as I notice that the press and people very much hope that I have a male heir, I am glad to associate with their point of view. Her delivery had not been free from anguish. She had chosen as her gynecologist Dr. Jahanshah Selah, a famous professor of medicine and brother to one of the Shah's favored but intractable foes, Alayar Selah. Her long labor had necessitated the use of pain medication, and the anesthesiologist chosen to help Dr. Selah had, in excitement, given her a higher than normal dose, causing her a late recovery of consciousness. At 11:15 on the morning of October 31st, the birth of the new imperial prince was announced with a 41-gun salute. While the royal family rejoiced in the hall, the Queen lay unconscious in her bed, as she writes in a querulous tone in her memoir. In the rejoicings, I think I was almost forgotten, and only my mother thought to ask, and my daughter, how is she? On November 4th, the court announced that, on the orders of His Majesty, the Shah, the newborn prince, has been called Reza. And then, the next day, only hours after the Queen and the newborn left the hospital, the Shah issued a new order, using Article 37 of the Constitution and appointing Reza as the Crown Prince. The inherent tensions and contradictions in the Shah's theory of kingship, at once modern and traditional, can be seen in his firemen. He writes, "By the grace of Almighty God, we, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Shahanshah of Iran, hereby proclaim that we now offer thanks to Almighty God for his heir the Crown Prince. And since the Almighty God has bestowed upon us a son by virtue of our authority, and in accordance with provisions of Article 37 of the Constitution and the consideration of his natural abilities and merits, we hereby decree our beloved son, Prince Shapur Reza, Crown Prince." In other words, it is not clear whether the appointment is by royal fiat, dependent on the will of the people as manifest in the Constitution, or based on the son's natural abilities and merits. It is a remarkable fact of the Shah's political life that during his entire 37-year rule he never commissioned or made an effort to offer a serious theory of why monarchy was suited to Iran's modern situation. When the American Constitution was drafted, some of the Founding Fathers felt compelled to write the Federalist Papers and offer a reasoned argument explaining why the new federalism was optimal. When in the 16th and 17th centuries the English monarchy was experiencing a crisis, King James I wrote dozens of treatises arguing that monarchy was the best system possible for England, though the Shah and his court commissioned a dozen biographies of himself and the Queen, though they sponsored hundreds of books chronicling the accomplishments of the Pahlavi dynasty. The Shah's only articulated thought on the monarchy's legitimacy was repeating the claim that monarchy is a natural system and deeply rooted in the Persian Geist. Equally revealing about the firemen appointing the Crown Prince was the order of appearance of different social strata. The Shah ordered that all members of our family, highest-ranking clerics of Islam, members of government, elected members of the Majlis and Senate governors, city managers, all commanders of the military and national police must follow the new Crown Prince. Only after mentioning all these groups did he go on to mention everyone in the great nation of Iran. In other words, the legitimacy of the new Crown Prince was assured first and foremost by royal fiat, and of all those who must afford the future ruler due deference, the royal family came first, followed by clerics of Islam. The people came last. This was a reversal of the order stipulated in the Iranian constitution, where kingship was a divine gift entrusted by the people. Such kingship was not so much an anointment as a gift, thus one that could be taken back by the same people who had bestowed it. In the Shah's firemen, his appointment played the most crucial role, and the people's consent was of least importance. Footnote: in those days in Iran, the didactic trinity written on the walls everywhere, from barracks and bazaars to classrooms, was God, Shah, country. In Morocco, another Muslim monarchy at the African end of the Islamic world, the trinity, no less prevalent, is God, country, and king. In Iran, then, the country exists for the king, while in Morocco the king exists for the country. End of footnote. Roughly 4 months after the announcement about the Crown Prince in March 1961, the royal court issued another statement announcing that, in the royal titles of ancient Persia, the original Persian term of Shabanu was used in place of Melike, queen, and thus in accordance to the new decree by the Shah, the word Shabanu will henceforth replace the word Meleke. Foreign embassies were also informed that henceforth, in referring to the Queen, the correct title would be either the Empress Farah or Her Imperial Majesty, the Empress Farah. The news of the birth of the successor to the throne was celebrated around the country as much by spontaneous burst of enthusiasm as by government encouragement. There was soon also a cacophony of destructive rumors spread by the opposition. Some claimed that the Shah was in fact important and that the Queen had feigned pregnancy by hiding a pillow under her dress. Others suggested that the infant had in fact been a girl and that she was changed with someone else's boy at the hospital. Jesus Christ! Even the choice of the clinic in the poorer sections of Tehran became the subject of conspiracies. The Queen used a hospital in the poor section of town, some whispered, only to facilitate the swap of her infant girl with a boy. The health of the newborn also became the subject of these rumors. Some said the infant was a mute, while others claimed that the demeanor showed him to be less than brilliant. Many of these rumors were first broadcast over radio stations based in Eastern Europe and were funded by the Soviet Union and run by the Tudeh Party. In the decade after the birth of the Crown Prince, the Shah's older daughter, Shahnaz, also suffered more than her fair share of rumors, gossip, and emotional travails. In a few months, there were rumors that Ardashir Zahidi and Shahnaz had apparently decided to get divorced. Strong pressure is being brought to bear on them to wait at least until the end of the Shah's American trip. When eventually, in the mid-60s, divorce did become a reality, as Alam's daily journals make clear, her life was complicated by increased tensions with her father over her chosen new husband, her lifestyle, and allegations of her attempt to live a hippie life, along with all of its accoutrements. The weight of events, the constant tension with Amini, and his anxiety about the Kennedy administration took their toll on the Shah. Their impact could be seen around the time of his scheduled state visit to Norway in May 1961. Amini, afraid that the military might attempt a coup in the Shah's absence, tried to get the royal couple to delay their trip. The Shah rejected the ideas, saying that such a cancellation would give the world the idea that there was a crisis in Iran. On May 18th, the Shah, accompanied by his wife, now officially bearing the title of Shabunu, arrived in Norway for what was to be an 8-day visit. To his host and to diplomats who saw the Shah in Oslo, he seemed clearly distraught. On the night of May 20th, the Shah and his wife gave a dinner in honor of their host at Oslo's Grand Hotel. The Shah had brought with him a large supply of special caviar, and according to all accounts, the dinner was one of the finest remembered in Oslo. But during the evening, to everyone's surprise, neither the Shah nor the Queen gave a talk, nor did either make any attempt to talk to their guests. The Shah was by nature a shy and timid man, invariably polite and attentive to the decorum of hospitality and diplomacy. Aside from being visibly angry with the Iranian ambassador, the Shah, according to diplomats who met him there, was also worried about developments in Iran. By the evening of May 25th, the Shah cut his journey short and left Norway. Again, it was widely believed that political developments in Iran necessitated the royal family's premature departure. In reality, the Shah and the Queen did not immediately return to Iran, but spent a few days in Italy before returning to a tumultuous Tehran, a city made politically more volatile by the public knowledge of rifts between the Shah and the new administration in the United States. A few months later, when the Shah and his Queen visited French President Charles de Gaulle, his mood had clearly improved. The worst of the political crisis seemed to be behind him, and his visit to France might have been the most pleasant experience of the year for the Shah. The Shah and the Queen left for France on October the 10th, 1961. Not only did he love France, as did his wife, but he perceived de Gaulle as something of an alter ego. Those who knew him well, like a lamb, knew that one of the highest compliments they could give him was to compare him to de Gaulle. Aside from all the many political qualities he admired in the general, there was also the question of his height. For the Shah, one of the most important measures for judging beauty and gravitas. In men, tallness conjured memories of his father, Reza Shah. In women, lanky and lean were two of his favorite aesthetic measures. Such was the Shah's adulation of de Gaulle that some observers have claimed that the referendum of January 26, 1961, when the 6 principles of the White Revolution were put to a popular vote, was inspired by de Gaulle's referendum. On the night of October 11th, in his speech at the state dinner in Paris, the Shah began by talking about his own special affinity for France, and the lofty place the French language has held in Iran's educational curriculum. The Shah praised the long history of friendship between Iran and France, going back to the age of Philip le Bel, who was the recipient of the first letter from an Iranian king. Iran, the Shah said, owes the first translation of our classics to your countrymen. Teaching Persian in Europe first began in Paris in the late 18th century. The first relics of our antiquity were discovered by French anthropologists. The next day, André Malraux, de Gaulle's revered minister of culture, who had traveled to Iran before and had a keen interest in the history of Iranian art, hosted a gala in honor of the Shah and the Queen and invited many of the French intellectual royalty to the party. More importantly, he developed a close relationship with the Queen. In an inscription in a book he had earlier given the Queen, he had written of his delight that Iran's enhancements are now associated with your destiny. This time he took her through the great museums of Paris. When the royal family returned to Tehran after what had been personally and politically successful trip, the Shah found the country awash with rumors of increasing tensions between him and his obviously frustrated prime minister. The British embassy captured the Shah's precarious position and the double bind he found himself in when it wrote, "If the Shah gets rid of Dr. Amini on his return from America, this will be an indication that he will henceforth take his orders direct from his American masters. If, on the other hand, he retains Dr. Amini, this will be because his American masters have told him to do so." Not just the Shah and Amini, but the nation awaited the meeting between the young Prince of Camelot and the tired Peacock Prince in April 1962. Footnote on Philip le Bel. Footnote. Philip le Bel, or Philip the Fair, or the Handsome, ruled France from 1268 to 1314. In spite of his apparent good looks, his critics said of him, "He is neither man nor beast. He is a thing." End of footnote.